My name is David Tussey. I'm not in New York City. I'm down in sunny South Florida right now. And this presentation is about a look at the 311 data in New York City to examine if there are trends that might indicate quality of life issues. Just a couple of protocol questions here when we get started. Questions and comments in the chat window. I'll pause periodically to try to review and answer those, but I do have to watch my time. Hopefully, we will have some time for some open Q&A. Slides are generally available for all the presentations about a week after the Open Data Week is available. But if you have any questions or comments or other thoughts, my email is right here in the presentation and feel free to reach out to me if you'd like. In fact, let me just put that in the chat window right now. Okay, so let's see what you've gotten yourself in here for. I used to have a leadership role for a while at what was at the time DoITT. That's now the organization that Alex works for. During that period of time, we did a major update to the 311 software in 2020. And for those who might not know, 911, of course, is the number you call for emergencies. 311 is the number you call for everything else. And there's about 3 million of those calls. I say calls. The biggest majority of them come online, of course, these days. But anyway, there's other channels that you can reach that. But that's a pretty big number per year. So even for a small percentage of some anomaly, that can translate into tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of records. So the question I have is, could the 311 data reveal trends regarding quality of life? And a lot of times in New York, they'll quote the crime statistics. Those are all very popular, of course, but that's not everything that makes up the quality of life as an urban city dweller. I started off with a somewhat naive approach. I thought, oh, this will be easy. Selected some 311 complaints that I thought would represent quality of life indicators, develop a baseline from the 2021 data, and then I would compare the last 4 years to that baseline. Those last 4 years just happen to correspond with Mayor Eric Adams' term. And then I just do some trend charts, easy cheesy, voila, we're done. Turned out not to be quite so easy. And part of, I think, the interest of doing this presentation is to just give an example of walking through this kind of analysis using open data, some of the challenges you face and some of the decisions you have to make to put it together, and some lessons learned on how that happens. And hopefully the conclusions that we reach looking at some of the present slides today will also be interesting. So some of the initial issues, the 2021 data proved to be erratic. There was a lot of missing data. It was unreliable. It had huge jumps. I don't know why that is. I do know that new software came on board in 2020 for 311. It affected how some of the other city agencies interact. There were also a lot of COVID effects. A number of complaint types dropped off dramatically in 2020. And of course, then different other ones spiked. So that turned out to be an unreliable data source to use for baselining. In addition, many of the complaints are very seasonal. So I thought initially I'll just capture the raw monthly counts, but that doesn't really capture the seasonal effects of some of these complaint types. So what I ended up doing is switching to 2022 as a baseline. That left me with 3 years that I could do trend data with. And then I developed a monthly index that was essentially a seasonally adjusted approach. So if later in some of the chart slides, 1.5 in December, that indicates a 1.5 times the number of complaints of that type that you would normally see in the month of December. So it's seasonally adjusted. All that sort of complicated the overall analysis and programming that had to be done to do this. So a lot of geeks in the audience, like myself. Just a quick review of the technical details. I used the open data portal. I just did a straight export for a 4-year data set. It comes out as a flat CSV file. It's a little less than 1 gigabyte. about 13.5 million rows of data. And then I developed code in R. I use the R language, and I use the Claude AI engine to develop most of the code. I had to pre-process the data and then produce the trend charts and what we'll call heat maps. And some of the things I had to do just to initially clean the data, I already spoke about the fact that the 2020 and 2021 data was erratic and not really usable. But I also had to convert the date fields from a text. That's how they come out as text. You have to convert them to dates. The column names have mixed case, so I converted all those to a snake case. And the text fields to all uppercase again, so I didn't have to worry about upper and lower cases. And then I converted the data to R's proprietary RDS file format, makes for easier processing, what is essentially a very large flat table with column headings on it. And then my methodology was to develop both trend charts and heat maps. The first thing I did was select complaints that I thought would represent quality of life. There's about 241 complaints types total in the data set. I picked 60 of those. Some examples here: graffiti, homeless assistance, abandoned vehicles. That was still a lot, 60. So I ended up grouping those 60 complaints into what I called families. That brought me down to 36. Some of the families: unsanitary conditions, animal abuse. Turns out there's about 4 different complaint types dealing with animals: illegal animals, pet abuse, dead animals, pet shops. So I grouped those all into a family. And that left me with 36. And then I further grouped them into bundles, sort of all the blight and nuisance complaints into one bundle, all those that deal with street signs into another bundle, sanitation, health, and so on. That gave me 11 different heat maps. And that's, I think, a good hierarchy to establish as I put these together. The heat maps are more for kind of executive level or maybe even mayoral usage. So that's a methodology. And what comes out of this are a bunch of trend charts. And let's go ahead and look at a couple here to just illustrate some of the data, and then I'll pop through. I'm just going to give some representative charts here, certainly not go through the whole full amount that's generated, but those are certainly available. And I can also separate the data by borough and by agency. Clever. So here's a chart. This is a complaint type called standing water, and it's illustrative of a number of the charts here. And so I'm just going to use this and another chart to give you an example of the kind of stuff I'm tracking. So standing water is, as you can imagine, standing water on a road or a sidewalk, typically with a blocked drainage or sewage access. And as you can see, this data is highly seasonal. On the charts, the shaded yellow areas represent spring and summer, and then the gray areas are fall and winter. So you can see that the standing water complaints rise over the spring and summer every year, and then they fall off dramatically in the fall and winter. And in fact, we don't even have any data points for December and January and February. And so this is really a phenomenon we only see during the spring and summertime seasons. Each of these dots represent a factor based upon the index from 2022. And for example, this high dot right here that's near 2 in the, let's see, this looks like the month of August. That indicates that there are approximately 2 times as many complaints that came in as normally seen in the month of August. And then, of course, the drops come down there as well. I do produce averages for each of the year on the charts, and then an overall trend line. And let's show another one. So here's a quality of life indicator: graffiti. I think we would all agree that this is pretty much something that's not desirable and affects our overall quality of life. And again, we see this rising spike in the spring and summer, and then this decline in the fall and winter. And that sort of repeats itself with almost this sawtooth chart, although the individual charts are. And the overall trend for this is up to about 1.5. And in fact, the number up here says we're trending worse with graffiti up 58%. And then, of course, the chart also shows the number of graffiti complaints, in this case, just under 60,000 over this 4-year period. So that's how I interpreted and built out these quality of life indicators. And then I'm going to show you good news, bad news, and new news. Let me look at the chat box here. Sherry brought up here homeless assistance category quality of life, which indicated you're measuring quality of life for house people. Reveals a bias. I'm not really trying to measure quality of life for house people, but I take your point. And that the choice of these quality of life indicators is my choice, and I'm trying to not express a bias, and I'll take that as a valid comment and I'll look into it. Thank you for bringing that up, Sherry. So let's look at some good news here. Consumer complaints. This started off with a pretty significant spike coming into 2023 from the 2022 data, and then it proceeds on a downward track all the way across the 3 years. And as you can see by the green colored line, consumer complaints are down 21%. Consumer complaints really are complaints against merchants, stores, bodegas, delis, dry cleaners. The number 3 complaint is against towing companies, tow and trucking companies, and also parking lots. But those are down pretty significantly. It's a collection. Okay, good news there. So here's another one, is street light condition. These are typically stoplights, of course, as well as it also includes just regular overhead street lights. And this is, again, coming off somewhat of a spike in 2022 and down at lower levels throughout the subsequent 3 years. So that's down 40% during that period of time. Good news. So this is rodent reporting. This is not the same as the rodent reports that you get from the health inspections for restaurants. These are really regular consumers that are reporting rodents. And this is a good story. This has been dropping down over the years, and you can see where the average for 2025 is way down, and that trend, even for the last few months, is also further down. I think one of the questions, anybody have a suggestion why we think the rodent reports might be down 25% over these 3-year period? No comments think about it. Yeah, people are tired. That Agata, I think you've got it. I think it's the new trash bin program. I think it's the containers that are locked and sealed, and as Andrea points out, there was a rat czar that was hired. There was a real increased emphasis on this activity, and it seems to show up in the data that it's down 25%. This is driven by the Department of Sanitation. Jessica Tisch was the commissioner during this period of time, so tip of the hat to her for really driving this down and for the city really putting some focus on that. And I think you can see the results there. And I think your guys are right in the chat box that they actually had efforts that were put in place that had observable results. Okay. So here's another one that's interesting. Broken parking meters. Why do you think this one would be down 40%? I think the broken parking meters, there's not a lot of these, 10,000. I think these are probably down about by the fact that, and Jessica points this out and Scott as well, that we shifted from the coin-operated mechanical parking meters to the digital parking meters that use an app, use the various parking apps that we go, and they're much more reliable and not subject to the kind of abuse that the mechanical meters also got. And again, that's showing up in the data with a strong 40% reduction in broken parking meter complaints as filed. Okay, let me look at the There's a couple of comments here in the chat box. So who's this? Etus? Let's see. 311 complaints. No, excuse me. Let me just back up a bit. My mistakes. Composting. We talked about that. Dates of policy. Danish points out it would be helpful to have dates of policy implementation to the plots. That is exactly right. It's one of the things I thought about is as you go through this timeline, are there critical events? Like in the early days, it was really obvious when COVID hit and things started to be closed down. So understanding kind of the timeline of certain critical events. And most of these complaints, most of them are agency centric in the sense that the housing preservation owns a number of them and transportation owns a number of them. And so if you knew what changes or policies from those agencies, that would be useful. Gitas points out that an arithmetic mean is non-robust without the underlying distribution. Absolutely true. If I had more data, I think I could develop that, but you're absolutely right. Note the weight. So let's see. Catherine asked for 311 complaints in general. Is there a way to note the weight, the date on repeat customers, squeaky wheels, singular events, many sound complaints? That information is in the data for the most part in what are called the details, but it would require some fairly significant parsing of what are essentially free-form text fields. I didn't undertake that, but that would certainly be something interesting to know. I know that the number one complaint for 311 is noise. There's 8 different categories of noise complaints. I know a lot of times, particularly for residential noise, the NYPD is very careful to try to make sure that they find and identify repeat reporters because an awful lot of times those are really more, I don't know, they're not really noise complaints. They're oftentimes personal bias against your neighbor or something like that. Okay, so let me show you some slides that are neutral. Street sweeping complaints. I lived in Manhattan for several years. Street sweeping, alternate side parking. These complaints, they're essentially unchanged over these last 3 years, spikes up and down. The last year looks like a little bit of a downtrend, but we end up exactly where we started in 2022. So that's completely neutral. Abandoned vehicles, again, some big spikes. These big spikes occur. Here's the December timeline. These are in January. Every January, there's a big spike. I don't know why that's so seasonal an event. Abandoned vehicles is interesting. If the license plate is on it, it's a problem for the NYPD. If the vehicle doesn't have a license plate, I think it's a transportation that has to answer to that. This is a nice trend the last 12 months here or so. People I see brought up here with people leaving in the winter, maybe snowbirds going to Florida. I know about that. Um, Okay, let's see. Here's another one that's neutral. Trash disposal down 1%. Nice trend here in the last 12 months, but some big spikes here. We're up to 1.75 times the number. I don't know why we would see these big spikes. Trying to analyze the why this occurs turns out to be really a second order analysis, and it would be very revealing, but it's not in this presentation. Okay, let's jump into a few of the not so good news. And let me just pause here for a second to look in the chat box. Parking is more limited when there's snow on the ground. Yeah, true. Yeah, snowbirds going south. Squeaky wheels, the most courageous agents or you're really exposed to landlord retaliation. Yeah, car breakdown in the winter, noise complaints. The noise complaints are really challenging. We worked with NYPD, residential noise, like for example, that can be just kids with the music too loud. It can also be a domestic dispute, and those can go south pretty quick. And there's also a lot of noise complaints that the NYPD deals with that are just, I hate to say it, vengeance complaints. The neighbor dog pooped in front of my townhouse, and I'm going to do a noise complaint on him or her, or boyfriend or girlfriend broke up. Anyway, not trying to identify the reasons. Let's look at a few of the not so goods. Illegal posting and dumping. Sorry, I grouped these into a family. This is up 43%. Some of the spikes here are up near 2 times as much, and they're not getting better in the last few years here. So there is a decline here, but there's seasonal declines in the spring, summer in general. This one seems to continue into the winter. Maybe that's hopeful, but overall, this trend has been up 40%. Unsanitary conditions. Again, this is a family where I've grouped together several related unsanitary conditions. That can be bad smell, it can be trash, it can be dirty conditions. And this is up 26% over this time frame that we're looking at. A little bit of a seasonal effect here as we can see some spikes in the summer months to be understood on that. Oh, I see Professor Yan has joined the conference. Professor Yan in the chat box here is a distinguished professor of statistics from the University of Connecticut, and he's really mentored me through some of the statistical analysis on this chart. And my hat's off to him for helping assemble and putting these ideas together. So here's a rather troubling one, the drug activity. This is reported drug activity by citizens, not necessarily NYPDs, although these all go over to NYPD for complaints. But the overall trend here is up, and it's up a lot. Look at the numbers on this scale. I had to enlarge the scale up to 9 to get in here. So we're looking at data points here in the summer of 2025 that are 8, almost 9 times higher than is normally observed in the in the June, July timeframe. That's a big spike. Now it's nice to see this drop in the 2025, end of 2024, 2025 year, but this overall activity is up over 300%. So this will show up on the heat maps as one of those areas where we really have to do anything. Catherine, I'm looking at the chat box there. Catherine says, does it say what kind of drugs? Again, I'd have to look at the freeform text field. It's not as robust as it used to be, but that's a real possibility. And you bring up a good point about the cannabis because, of course, there's been a lot of recent legislation in terms of cannabis usage and sale in the state of New York. I don't really know the whys. I know there's some data that shows this has been a problem over the last 3 years, and that's by kind of an idea. Eric brought up a good point. That's a good point, Eric, that in the past that was really treated as a class 1 drug and not so much here. Again, it would be nice to see when these policies go into effect here. My baseline, Chris asked the question, is your baseline just a single year 2022? It is, because the data in 20 and 21 that I wanted to use turned out to be very erratic. A lot of it was missing. It was unreliable. There were some huge spikes, and it just was not good. It was not a good baseline to use. I tried to come up with some ways of measuring it out and ruling out the outliers and determining whether it was a mean or median was most appropriate. But I ended up having to use just 1 year of underlying data, and I know that's not great. But again, this project led me to that particular point, and that's what I got. No, I'm sorry I'm mispronouncing your name. Is it Gitas? Gita said, would location analysis be a next step? There is location data included in the NYPD or in the 311 data. There is street address and there's also lat longs. And of course, those, I'm sure they're geocoded from the street address, but those map immediately to some geospatial software. And that would really be interesting to see where exactly that has gone here. Let me move on here. Watch my time just a little bit. This one troubles me. This is lead, and the increase of lead. Notice here in the heading, I put that this is both HPD. They, of course, handle the public housing, and we know that public housing is really old in many parts of the city, and there's a lot of lead paint and lead pipe issues. But it also includes DOB, the Department of Buildings. So these are buildings that have lead issues in those. And this is an overall trend. 2024 is particularly troubling here. These two red dots indicate that there are spikes in the data that go beyond the vertical limit of this chart. And And I had to modify the vertical scale here to capture the large increase. This is up 120, almost 120% in the 2022 to 2025 range. And that's troubling. And it's not a small amount. It's 55,000 reports. Okay, I'll call these mayoral dashboards. It was really building these bundles and trying to represent them as mayoral executive level items. And I'm going to show three of them here. There's a total of 11, but they all look more or less the same. And I'll show you a summary at the end. So here's the heat map for public health. And this includes lead, mobile food vendors, food establishment, the whole animal abuse, illegal dead animal thing, and consumer complaints. Now, I've grouped these into public health. I'm open to ideas on how to group them differently, but the idea is, and I've drawn some boundaries here between what I think is like really bad, slightly bad, really good, and those kinds of ideas. And we could certainly review and say where we want to mark those. But the idea was to roll these up into some high level bundles and present those in kind of a heat map format that might be useful for executive decisions, policy making, and even at a mayoral level. Let me pause just a second and see what other kind of information is here. Does the Open tab already run their own analysis? Lots of sit and science on how much of that. I'll leave that to the open data team, but Catherine, you bring up a good point, and I'll pause for a second. One of the challenges is with all this open data is really who's using it. Is it being actually used in a positive manner to essentially tap into the people of the city of New York and the greater area? Because it's not just the citizens, it's of course all the people that come into New York, tourists and workers, and actually make use of that data to try to advocate certain kinds of policies and decision making. And as responded there, usually the open data team's responsibility is just obtaining and maintaining the database it's in an Oracle data warehouse. And that is a challenge in and of itself. So is there a lot that could be done here? I think there is a lot to be done here. So Virginia points out lead should probably be in buildings, health and safety. Good point. That's a good point. Yeah, I could probably bit that one in pub. That's good. Let's see. Jason points new local law requires routine testing to cover 100% of apartments. Good feedback here. Makes sense. Let's see. Virginia pointed out the issue of whether a specific complaint can be called in or uploaded. Cannot take a complaint that is represented in a category drop-down menu. Virginia, I'm not entirely sure that's true. I'm pretty sure it's possible to override and put in a free-form text. I've certainly seen the difference in the number of complaint types vary dramatically, but in general, I would think that they would try to do that item. Let's look at a couple more of these heat maps and get a little bit of another picture here. So here's one on street safety. Again, I've included these into street safety, drug activity, really significant. Handhandling, that's still a problem. Bike and skate, this includes e-scooters. No, I'm sorry, I pulled e-scooters out separately because that's a high interest item. Abandoned, the gray here is unchanged. Broken parking meters, we talked about that. That's really dramatically improved. And let me show a third one here, which I called blight and nuisance. Graffiti, using obviously color coding here. We looked at illegal postings and dumping, and rodents are better off. Now, let's look at this summary slide. These are all, over here on the left, are all the bundles, the heat maps that I created. And then these are the sort of the where they count. Blight and nuisance has one that's improved. That's great. It's got two that are worse and one that is much worse. And similar for these others down the line. And then, so I grouped these together. If you take this as an overall view of quality of life in New York City, and I realize that's a bit of a jump, in the kind of what I would call the okay category, improved, slightly improved, or not really much change, that represents about 32%. See, it almost divides into a third. 27% that I call in the fair is slightly worse. And then, unfortunately, 41% of these stoplights, not of the actual things, fall into the worse or much worse category. And I quoted that needs attention. Dinesh, you're reading ahead of me here. Let's go to the lessons learned here. First step is cleaning the data. Wherever you start with one of these analysis, you're always going to have to deal with, I think, some dirt in the data. You got to look at that and you got to clean that. And that often takes a lot of time and as much time as it does to actually take the coding. I got to do a shout out here to some of the AI tools. I use Claude significantly. It really can accelerate coding and just some simple things you want done. You want a list sorted in alphabetical instead of by count. Choosing the quality of life indicators, that's subjective. Open to ideas. There's certainly other ways to look at that, other things to move into different categories. This is a first cut. The family charts and the heat map, I think, could really be useful for informing city funding and policy decisions. And then there's this real question of could this be made something like this? Could we tap into this 311, this very rich data source of 3 million complaints a year, and use that as some sort of barometer that would be available for public awareness and even for and especially for, I think, funding and policy decisions. So those are, yeah, that's where we end up. It's like interesting charts, David. Can we actually do something about this? Could we understand the underlying why this occurs? And can we use this for city planning, for mayoral efforts, for funding and policy decisions? Let me look at some of the questions here in the Catherine box. So Catherine says, gotcha. Is there is a data science team within an office of policy and planning works with you on all the improving city space based on the information you all are maintaining? That I'm not sure the open data team is involved in kind of the analysis and causation correlations that might be there. Dinesh points out, could this be something New York City planning could add to the community profile pages, community board? I started to break the data down. Do I have let's see, did I include, oh, look. So I did include one chart to show overall complaints by boroughs. I know I left out Bronx. Okay, guilty, didn't fit on the page. You could break this data down by borough. You have to be really careful if you go down to community board level because the data gets pretty sparse on some of these. But if you look at how things are going in the borough, so you see Staten Island is actually no change. The number of complaints from Queens is up 17%. Manhattan's up 24%. Brooklyn, pretty unchanged. Bronx, believe it or not, was down a little. But you could go ahead and slice and dice this into, I think, the organizational units of the city of New York, most importantly, borough presidents, and then also community boards. And I think the idea of doing geographic mapping is really an interesting idea. That would be a really interesting next step. Look, there's a lot of data that could be gleaned from this and a lot of additional analysis that I think could be done to try to map this to policy changes, personnel changes, funding changes in city law, as well as technology changes like the broken parking meters. You're right. Would love to open my own consulting business to help do some of that kind of stuff, but I do think there's a lot of information here, and that was my conclusion, that there's a lot of information here that actually could be discerned, visualized, made available for the public, and used by city officials for funding and policy decisions and emphasis in certain areas. Let me look through the chat box here just a second. Noel points out we can also sort by who needs to respond. Parks Department. I have the data in this data report by agency, so I could certainly break out which are Parks and Rec, which are NYPD, which are Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. And that's actually fairly straightforward to do because that data is right in there. You just have to sort by another field. Some of the stuff is a little confusing because, like I said, in the case of animal abuse, illegal animals, venomous snakes and other kind of animals, primates, tigers, lions, and bears. My favorite, hedgehogs. Those are illegal in New York City. Those are generally because it's illegal. Those are handled by NYPD. Animal abuse is actually, I think, Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. Dead animals, mostly in parks, is really handled by sanitation. So sometimes the department breakout is not quite as useful, or you have to bundle some of the stuff together. But you absolutely could do that, and the data is right there, and it could be easily broken out and sorted. Like it's like building an Excel pivot table. You could easily slide agency into the column and see how that breaks out. Sherry points out, Sherry, you get the bonus prize today. Please be, there is a lot of challenges with case sensitivity and problem detail, even in the agency fields. That drives me nuts. And one of the first things I had to do when I brought the data into R is essentially take all the text fields and convert them to all caps. That's what I did. But the mixed cases of problems, some of the date fields are problematic. My cell phone is responding. Signed a service request data through near Manhattan Borough President mentioned, who is that? Eric mentioned using data like this, working with Beta New York to create neighborhood report cards. That's, of course, exactly where this goes, and that's what I exactly would like to see. And that's what I'm suggesting here. Let's see what other items are in the chat box here. Presentation data. Yes, Moses McCall did a presentation where he mapped the 311 reports. It's very straightforward to do. You can even do that in the open data portal to a great extent. Although I generally found out that bringing the data out and then processing it with some custom written software generally gives you a little better results. You could do agencies. City council could look at complaints by agencies. Absolutely. You got it. You guys are good. You're right on this. This is exactly where this stuff goes. Amaze, amaze, amaze. That's really all the presentation that I wanted to make. I think this is some good questions brought up in the Q&A session. Open here about any open questions that people might want to bring up. Alec, do you want to unmute any microphones here? See if we've got a little bit of time for some Q&A. Dinesh, what do you mean by complaint fatigue? I'm not sure I understand that phrase. Any other questions or comments? Do I know if open data has data on rent? Not in the 311 data. So participants can unmute if you want to ask a question. Manhattan Borough President Office, I don't know that. Thanks, David. Anyway, the intent of this presentation as I got into it was to say, look at some of the stuff that's there. Here's some of the efforts you have to make to extract it. Here's some way to visualize it and some thoughts about, is there some data in here that would be really useful for several of the for leadership, I think, in the city of New York to do that. Noel, I did some work on agency response time. It varies dramatically by agency, and there's some funny stuff that goes on because there's a number of agency complaints that are closed immediately as they're opened. I don't think that's exactly what's happening. I think they probably close it in the 311 system, but it remains in a local information system that they might be processing in sanitation or home or HPD. But the open and closed dates and times down to the second are in the 311 data, and you certainly can use it to look at some response times. For example, Park and Recs, their response times are in years to respond to certain sort of complaints, and that's the businesses they're in. Catherine says, is there a reason scientists want to engage with three or more than other data? I think because it's a very robust data set. It's large, it's comprehensive. It goes back to, I don't know, 1997 or something like that. So there's a lot in there.
David, I just wanted to, this is Sharon. I was going to ask you a question which might also touch on one aspect of what Catherine's asking. And that as a resident who engages regularly with both my community board, city council member, and other agencies, city agencies, that we are regularly told that if there's an issue that we would like to raise awareness about, we use 311 complaints. That I can't tell you how many times it's stressed. And so if there, it just goes, one of the reasons why people, citizen scientists might want to engage with that data set is because that's where a lot of people take their issues to explain what they're living through and what they're experiencing in the city, because they're regularly channeled toward that 311 report as the way to actually raise awareness.
The increase in the 311 data over the last 5 years has been right at about 20%, and that's 20% of a big number. The real huge spike happened in 20 and 21 with COVID. And I'm proud to say when we brought the new software on board in fiscal year 2020, which was in July of 2019, we did extensive load testing on the software, and it's cloud based. We could do dynamic expansion of capacity. When COVID hit, I do not think the old software would have been able to handle those levels of workload. But you're absolutely right. There's an increased emphasis to try to use 311 as a data source. I think along with that comes a responsibility for maintaining the system, maintaining the data at a high quality, and then actually doing the analysis that draws conclusions and inferences from the data. Otherwise, we're just collecting data. Let me look at just a couple. There's one coming here about from Eric about Bloomberg. Mayor Bloomberg, I used to work for Bloomberg. Michael Bloomberg did something really interesting with his company. He had one phone number that you could call from any place on earth, any country. You could be connected with a handful of different language speakers, and it didn't matter if the complaint was, how do I use this piece of software to my computer doesn't load Microsoft Excel. And when he came to be mayor, he really consolidated the various agency complaint lines into the 311. And that was really one of his major efforts, and it's proven to be really resilient and work out a lot. I will say the software update that we did in 2019, 2020 was the first one that had been done since 2003. Let's look quickly at the other questions and then we'll call it a day here.
David, this is Virginia. Do you mind if I ask a quick question?
Of course not.
I have a particular interest in the harassment of rent-stabilized tenants in the city. And I was doing some research trying to find on the open data. I'm not an expert on it at all, but I was trying to find harassment reports on 311. And what I found is that there actually is no harassment report data on 311, although if you call 311 and say that you feel you're being harassed, they will transfer you to a city agency. But I had to go into the court system to find the history of harassment cases that have more than quadrupled since 2017.
Wow, ouch.
I think it actually might have quadrupled, but I'm still working on it. But I literally had to take PDFs of the quarterly reports on the website. And then once the New York courts went online, they do not actually track harassment cases. They track other things, but not specifically harassment. So Brad Hoylman, our Manhattan Borough president, always says, if you're not measuring it, you can't fix it. And so one of the things I thought you were talking about, how you're grouping some of these issues into families. When tenants call into 311 and they're complaining about a lack of services, and they're complaining about mice and rats, and they're complaining about mail theft or doors that don't lock or construction in the building, many of these items are actually, they are tenant harassment, but the tenants might not actually perceive it yet as that, but it's accumulating to be a long-term effort to get rent stabilized tenants out of their buildings, often because they're lower paying tenants typically. So my question is, would it be possible to organize like the groupings of what I know to be categories of tenant harassment into families so that you could see that these groups are actually could fall under harassment and track it that way.
There's not data in the 311 system. You're right. There's no data that I recall. I don't recall seeing any complaint types that deal with like tenant landlord issues. God, extracting data from PDF documents.
Oh, no, I'm not talking about doing that necessarily. I already did that manual stuff.
That sounds terrible.
Yeah, but it's
just
I had to go back and do like quarterly reports on the New York system. But anyway, it's a really important thing. And one of the reasons we're having a housing crisis right now is because there are all of these efforts to get rent stabilized tenants out of their buildings, and yet it's not being tracked in the data in a way, like even some landlords know how to avoid the eviction flags. They literally push their tenants into housing court and then they pay them $5,000. They'll drop the eviction case and the tenant walks away with $5,000 to move out. So I don't want to spend more time. Everyone's got other questions, but I just wanted to say there are other issues about how certain things are tracked in the city that can help the city and the mayor see how big a problem is instead of having to wait before the problem actually becomes a lawsuit.
Hey, I'm with you. I think those are exactly the things we should be using this data for. We have lots and lots of data available. Some of it may not be in very accessible formats like a PDF document, but getting that information out, making it available to the policymakers and the leaders of New York that's what I really see as the value here. David Tussey doing a presentation in Open Data Week is great, but getting some of that information to the borough presidents, the community board leaders, the mayor's office, I think would be really important and insightful. And I wish there was some real incentive and a dedicated organization within the city government of New York that was undertaking these kinds of analysis efforts. It's not the open data team. Their job is to get the data and get it in the right place and make it accessible. But it sure would be helpful if there were other activities and organizations that were doing that. Yes. This is interesting. Eric, you point out city council can create new complaint types if you were being proposed. We're just looking through the chat here. Oh, and decision making with verified open source data. Yeah, that would be the goal. Listen, let's wrap it up there. Alex, I'll turn it back to you for final questions or comments.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, David. Thank you so much. So first of all, yeah, I would like to thank you for all the hard work that went into this presentation. This was very informative, and thank you. I thank you everyone who participated and joined this discussion. It was a very lovely discussion. A lot of opinions were shared. And
I hear you. Look, I get it. Everybody that lives in New York, it may be the city that never sleeps, but it's a city that complains all the time. So there's a lot there.